All right, in this video, we're going to look at some computer-assisted audit techniques for the audit of IT. Terminology is key here, and terms like test data, integrated test facility, embedded audit module, parallel simulation, generalized audit software. These are things that are going to come up on the exam, and you're going to have to know one from the other. These are computer-assisted audit techniques that don't replace the auditor's two eyes, as computers cannot replace human judgment. For example, you can use software to recount inventory totals, but you still need an auditor to observe the inventory and observe that certain duties are segregated. So we'll start with test data. Test data is used by an independent auditor to test the client's IT controls to see if those controls were working during the period under audit. So with test data, an auditor might request payroll checks for people with valid and also invalid employee numbers. So let's test the client's payroll system by requesting a check for one valid and one invalid employee number and determine how such transactions are handled by the client's system. Now with test data, the auditor knows in advance how the results should be. For example, the auditor already knows that the client's system should be rejecting the request for a payroll check for an employee with an invalid employee number. The client's payroll system should process the payroll for only those entries that contain the valid employee numbers and reject the request for the person with an invalid employee number. So the auditor need only test one valid and one invalid condition in order to take care of that control, right? We don't have to ask for 22 valid employees and 36 invalid employee numbers. As long as we do one valid and one invalid, and it handles it properly, prints a check for the valid employee, rejects the request for the invalid, then we know that particular control is operating. With test data, the client system is offline at the time the test data is run. So the client is not running their payroll while the auditor is doing this test, but there still is a risk, even though the client's not running live. Even though the client system is offline, there's still a risk to using test data, because the auditor did request a check for a valid employee, and that request should have been processed by the client's system. Well, the challenge is that the auditor must make sure that the test data is not later included with the client's payroll records, which means that check that we just requested was processed and now it's part of the client's payroll records. So we have to make sure that's reversed out. That's the challenge of using test data. So in test data, the client is not running live payroll at the time of the test, but the records that are processed during the test, if they're not reversed out, they'll become part of the permanent payroll record. What are some other uses of test data? Well, so far, we requested a check for an invalid employee. Another use of test data would be the auditor requesting two paychecks for the same employee. If functioning properly, the payroll program should handle this error and not process the two paychecks. In fact, probably not process any paychecks for that one employee, but instead print out an error report saying something like, hey, you requested two checks for this one employee. This error report should go to the control team for follow-up before processing will continue. See, the auditor's always interested in error resolution. Note that the auditor need not test for all invalid conditions, just one valid and one invalid. So we don't have to ask for two checks for 22 different employees, just one. Just ask for two checks for one employee and one check for one employee and see how the system handles that. Now, test data could be time consuming for the auditor because test data programs need to be tailor-made by the auditor for each client's computer application. So you're going to need test data to test the payroll program. You're going to need different test data to test accounts payable. Also, the auditor needs to determine that the application program tested was actually used by the client during the period under audit to process the data. Since we don't know if they used it and when the last time they used it was, since they're not using it while we're performing the test data. So we might need to make an inquiry, when did you last use this system? Which of the following is correct regarding test data? 1. Test data refers to a technique where the auditor uses the client's application program to process a set of auditor data to determine whether client controls are operating effectively. Yes, that sounds like test data. Notice the data is the auditor's data. The auditor shows up with auditor data to test the client's system. 2. With test data, the auditor will request the client system to process at least one valid condition and at least one invalid condition, but need not test all invalid conditions. That's true, and that's often the way they ask you questions about test data. The answer is both, 1 and 2, letter C. So a giveaway that they're asking you about test data is where one of the choices says something like, the auditor need not test every invalid condition, because all you need to do is have one valid and one invalid, and you can see if the control is working. So the auditor may or may not choose to test for every possible invalid condition within the payroll system. As long as the control you're interested in can be tested by choosing one valid condition and one invalid condition, that's good enough for test data. Remember what we said, if you're going to see whether or not the payroll system will process payroll for a person with an invalid employee number, all you need to do is request one person with an invalid employee number. You don't have to request everybody who may have one time worked for the company, just one valid and one invalid condition. All right, let's try this. Which of the following is true of the test data approach? A, test data must consist of all possible valid and invalid conditions. Well, we know that's not true, although that does relate to test data, where you test one valid and one invalid condition. B, test data are processed by the client's computer programs under the auditor's control. Yes, that sounds like test data. C, since the client's program is not running live, there is no risk to using test data. Wrong. We said we're actually corrupting the data for a time, and we're going to have to get that information off the system, otherwise it'll become part of the permanent system. D, when using test data, each control tested should be tested several times. Doesn't need to be tested more than once, because if a computer is processing this correctly when we test it, then it should be processing this correctly all the time. It should have processed this correctly during the whole period under audit. All right, Rudy Corp has recently installed a new computer payroll processing program. Before the program is used to compute actual payroll checks for the employees, test data is going to be run through the computer to see how it would be processed. Which of the following is least likely to be tested in this manner? How about A, 2 checks requested for the same employee? No, you'd want to see how the computer handled that request. So that would be perfect for test data. B, a check requested for an employee who quit 2 months earlier. That would be perfect for test data, because there's the example of a person with an invalid employee number. C, a check requested for an employee working more than 60 hours per week. Well, that would be a good use of test data as well, because here in letter C we have a potential problem. Not an actual problem, but a potential problem that we may have set up a limit test where nobody can have more than 40 hours a week or more than 50 hours a week. So we could request a check for somebody with 60 hours, something that exceeds the limit, and see how the computer processes it. And then D, a check requested for an employee paid an hourly rate of $12 per hour. Well, why would you use test data for that? You're certainly going to have an employee with a $12 an hour rate. See, in letter D, there's nothing suspicious about a $12 an hour rate. That comes out to about $24,000 a year. So we said test data hopes to verify that the computer will produce an error report where there's a problem, such as in letter A and B, or a potential problem, such as letter C, and these problems or potential problems need to be cleared before actual processing proceeds. So if it's a new system, this is what the client would do, use test data. If it's an existing system, the auditor would come in and use test data. So it's the same idea. You have a real problem in letter A and B. 2 checks requested for the same employee, or a check requested for an employee who quit 2 months earlier. So you're testing how that real problem would be handled. Letter C, you'd have a potential problem. What if there's an error and somebody requests a check for somebody who works more than 60 hours a week? Well, let's see how the system would handle that. Letter D doesn't pose a problem, either real or potential, so test data really wouldn't help with that. How about this? An auditor most likely would introduce test data into a computerized payroll system to test internal controls related to the, one, early cashing of payroll checks by employees. Well, I don't see how testing a computer system is going to tell you anything about early cashing of the checks. But two, discovery of invalid employee numbers. That's why you're going to use test data, because that's an invalid condition. So let's go with B. All right, another term, big term besides test data is integrated test facility, and they're often in the same multiple choice question where you have to choose one or the other. Integrated test facility is similar to the test data approach, except that the test data now is going to be integrated into the system in the midst of live transactions. So while the client's running live, here comes the auditor with the test data and trying to mix it in to the live computer run. Remember, the test data approach, the client was not running payroll during the auditor's test of the payroll system. Well, with ITF, the test data can be introduced while the client is processing the payroll. How can that be? Well, usually because the client system has created a hypothetical dummy database specifically for the test data to be run through while live transactions are being processed. So with ITF, the test data is initially commingled with the live data. So often the client's employees don't even know that the testing is being run. So the challenge is to make sure that the test data is being fed into the dummy database and doesn't corrupt the real files. So once again, there's an issue with this too. It's not without its risk, but it's a little bit easier because if it's designed properly, while the test data is initially commingled with live data, it eventually goes through a dummy database and gets coded there so that it doesn't corrupt the real files and you don't have to go back and reverse it out. An example of integrated test facility is where fictitious employee names could be included in every payroll run and give them excessive overtime too. If this test data is handled correctly, the assumption is made that the program is functioning as intended. So we can use the term test data when we talk about integrated test facility because it does involve test data, but it happens to be done while the client is running live, so we're going to call it integrated test facility. And this way, the computer program can be tested with every run rather than just periodically. Client operating personnel are usually unaware of the testing process. So once again, we're using auditor data to test the client's system, but this time the client system is running live. All right, which of the following is true regarding integrated test facility? 1, fictitious and real transactions cannot be processed together because error reports would interrupt processing. Not true. With integrated test facility, we make sure that the data that's being tested is coded to a dummy database so it doesn't interrupt processing. 2, client operating personnel need not be involved in the testing process. That's true, and they often don't even know that it's going on. So let's go with 2 only, letter B. All right, with regard to the audit of IT, which of the following is correct regarding test data and integrated test facility, ITF? 1, integrated test facility utilizes a dummy database to test the client system while processing live data, allowing no corruption of the actual files. I like that one. 2, test data is performed on the client system during a live operation, but integrated test facility, ITF, is not. And the answer is 1 only, because 2 says it backwards, doesn't it? Yeah, see, with 2, with test data is performed on the client system during a live operation. No, ITF is performed on the client system during the live operation. So it's 1 only, letter A. All right, what did test data and ITF have in common? Test data and ITF had in common that auditor data was introduced to test the client's system. The auditor showed up with his own data to test the client's system. All right, so where does that leave parallel simulation then? Parallel simulation is a technique in which the auditor reprocesses the client's data, but using the auditor's own generalized audit software program. So remember what we said about test data and ITF. Test data and ITF, auditor data was used to test the client's system. Well, now with parallel simulation, client data is used on the auditor's system, and then we're just going to compare the results. So the auditor is going to show up with his own generalized audit software program, or maybe grab a duplicate copy of the client's own program. But the key is we're going to use client data, and then we're going to compare results because we're testing two different systems with the same client data to see if we get the same results. The software purchased by the auditor should be able to obtain the same results as the client's computer program, or maybe the client hands the auditor a duplicate version of the program, depending on how they want to make this test. We're going to use client data, not auditor data, and we're going to compare two systems. The auditor then compares his results to those results obtained by the client's computer. So with parallel simulation, the auditor is going to process actual client data rather than dummy transactions, but we're going to use the auditor's system rather than the client's system. So the client runs payroll on their computer system, let's say for 3 employees. They all work 8 hours, and they all earn a total gross of $500. The gross was $500 for each employee, and the client's payroll program calculated the net pay for each employee, let's say at $350. So this is the way the client's system ran the payroll. They had $500 gross for each employee and $350 net. Now let's see what the auditor comes up with for totals when the auditor runs parallel with the auditor's system. The auditor takes the same client payroll run, 3 employees working 8 hours, earning a total of, if it comes out to $500 each, well, we got the gross. Now the auditor performs the same calculations, gross to net, on the auditor's program and expects to get a net of $350 also. And if he does, then you have parallel simulation. But if the auditor does not get $350, this needs to be investigated because one of the two systems has an error. So remember, test data and ITF, they had in common that auditor data was used to test the client's one and only system. Parallel simulation, the auditor shows up with his own system and asks for the client data, and we run parallel, one system against the other, and we hope to get the same results. All right, the limitations of parallel simulation is the time it might take to build an exact duplicate copy of the client's system, or any incompatibility between the two systems, or tracing any differences that you might find in the two sets of output back to the differences in the programs. That might be challenging and might take some time. So where do we get these parallel systems? We said programs to accomplish parallel simulation can be specifically developed for the application, or they could be bought as a packaged program, or they could be produced by what's called a generalized audit software package. So generalized audit software goes along with parallel simulation, because remember, you need a second system in parallel simulation. And where do you get that second system from? Well, you could build it, but that could take a while. The client can hand you a duplicate copy, but that might not be what you're here to test. So you might need a second system, and that could come from a generalized audit software package or something customized. So that brings us to the next area, which is generalized audit software packages. And these GASPs allow the auditor to perform these tests directly on the client's system with only limited knowledge of the client's computer system. So one use of a generalized audit software package would be for parallel simulation, but you can also use generalized audit software packages to run tests directly on the client's system. The auditor would first define the client's system and then specify the tests and selections that should be made. And generalized audit software packages, they generate the programs necessary to interrogate the client files, extract data that usually has to meet certain criteria in order to analyze that particular data. So tasks typically performed by generalized audit software packages include examining transactions for control compliance, reconciling data from 2 separate files, recalculating amounts and totals, and selecting items for testing that meet certain criteria. Generalized audit software can be used to sort data in ascending or descending order, summarize data by customer account number, and make file comparisons maybe of payroll details with personnel records. Here's an example of the use of generalized audit software. It can be used to select accounts receivable balances that are over the normal credit limit, or maybe select transactions with related parties. Now, generalized audit software packages will allow the auditor to perform these tests test of controls and substantive tests directly on the client's system. And this is big, allows an auditor to sample and test a much higher percentage of transactions, which results in a more reliable audit. This is also big. GASP's Generalized Audit Software packages require little or no technical knowledge by the auditor about the client's hardware or software features, and that's often in the question on Generalized Audit Software. The fact that it doesn't require the auditor to be an expert with regard to the hardware and the software, because the auditor is going to show up with Generalized Audit Software of his own and be able to just extract data right from the client's system. So these generalized packages, they do allow for reduction of audit time after initial use. There are also customized audit software programs. Of course, there are generalized audit software, but there's customized audit software too, specifically written to access the files of a particular client. So customized versus generalized. The disadvantages of the customized is they can only be used for that particular client, where generalized audit software costs may be amortized over many clients. All right, which of the following is correct with regard to computer-assisted audit techniques? 1. Generalized audit software packages require little or no technical knowledge about the client's hardware or software. That's right, and that's always there on the exam, so make sure you don't miss that. 2. An auditor can use generalized audit software to perform parallel simulation. Absolutely. We'll go with both. Generalized audit software requires little or no technical knowledge by the auditor about the client's hardware or software. The auditor would first define the client's system and then specify the tests and selections. And the generalized software would generate the program necessary to interrogate the files, be able to extract the data that meets certain criteria. And then 2 is correct. Programs to accomplish parallel simulation. Remember, number 2 here asked about the relationship between generalized audit software and parallel simulation. And programs to accomplish parallel simulation can be specifically developed for the application or bought as a packaged program or produced by a generalized audit software package. Remember, in parallel simulation, we're using client data to test 2 systems and investigate any differences. All right, limitations of computer-assisted audit techniques. While all audit software, both general and customized, are of great use to the auditor to access client data files, prepare spreadsheets, perform substantive tests without being an expert with regard to the client system, software alone cannot replace human judgment. And look out for questions like that on the CPA exam. It's the auditor that still assesses control risk. There's no software application that will assess control risk. And another big term in this area is embedded audit module. You know, some of these terms are pretty heavy, so if you've never seen this before, embedded audit module are for systems that don't have a permanent audit trail. Some systems don't have a permanent audit trail. These systems require that any audit take place while processing takes place. So embedded audit modules are routines that are built into the application program to perform an ongoing audit function at a particular place in the processing. Sometimes audit modules are embedded into the client's computer system for easy testing by the auditor. An example of embedded audit module is where the program knows that the auditor wants to test every sales transaction greater than $5,000, so the program is designed or embedded with a hook or a module built in for that purpose. Now, embedded audit modules, since they're built into the client's application program when the program is developed, the auditor usually participates in that. So this is the opposite of generalized audit software, where the auditor can get away with not being so knowledgeable about the hardware and software. Here, the auditor is going to be involved in putting the module together while the system is being developed. The auditor is going to have to come in and embed the module. It's a section of an application program code that's going to collect transaction data for the auditor, so the auditor would want to be involved in that process. All right, in an audit of IT, which of the following pertains to embedded audit module? 1, typically requires the auditor to be involved in system design of the application to be monitored. Yes, you would only need that with embedded audit module because it's the auditor that wants to embed some kind of hook into the system as transactions are processed. Otherwise, there'd be no other way to get audit evidence. 2, allows for capture of audit data as transactions occur. Yes, both 1 and 2. Let's go with C. Okay, so embedded audit module typically requires the auditor to be involved in system design of the application because the auditor needs to add the audit module at a certain hook or a desired place in the processing. And 2 is right. Embedded audit module typically allows for capture of audit data as transactions occur, and this is useful when client systems do not retain permanent audit trails. Okay, now we've gone through a lot of these terms. Let's see what we can answer. Which of the following methods of computer-assisted auditing allows the auditor to process actual client data through an auditor's system and after processing, compare the output with the client's output? Well, that's going to be what? Parallel simulation, letter C. Parallel simulation verifies processing of actual transactions, client data, as opposed to test data and ITF. Which of the following correctly describes sections of the client's application program code that collect transaction as data is processed for the auditor? That's your embedded audit module, letter A. So your ability to compare one to the rest, very important. A generalized audit software package is used to perform tests directly on a client's system. An auditor would use generalized audit software packages to 1. Select items that meet specified criteria, yes. Recalculate totals, yes. Assess control risk, be careful. We said that only a person could do that. So I'm liking 1 and 2, but not all 3. Let's go with C. Assessing control risk is a human activity that requires judgment. A primary feature of using generalized audit software packages to audit the financial statements of a client that uses a computerized system is that the auditor what? So what would you use generalized audit software packages for? 1, the auditor may access information stored on computer files while having a limited understanding of the client's hardware and software. Does that go along with generalized audit software, the limited understanding? Yes. 2, auditor is able to sample and test a much higher percentage of transactions when using generalized audit software. Yes, absolutely. Let's go with both 1 and 2. Because remember, with things like embedded audit module, you're only going to be able to test where the hooks are. All right, when conducting field work for a physical inventory, an auditor cannot perform which of the following steps using a generalized audit software package. What can you not do with software? A, analyze data resulting from inventory. Now, you can analyze data very well with generalized audit software. B, recalculate balances in inventory reports. That would be very easy to do with generalized audit software. C, select sample items of inventory that meet your criteria. Once again, that would be very easy with generalized audit software. D, observing inventory. You're going to need 2 eyes for that. You're going to need human eyes for that. Let's go with D. All right, an auditor would least likely use computer-assisted audit techniques to construct parallel simulations. Now, you would need computer software for that. B, prepare spreadsheets. Well, you'd probably use some type of software to prepare spreadsheets. C, access client data files. Now, you'd probably use generalized audit software for that. D, assess IT control risk. Yeah, that's where you would least likely use computer-assisted audit techniques. Assessing IT control risk would require human judgment. Let's go with D. Advantages and disadvantages now. One of information technology's potential benefits is the enhanced timeliness of information. So timeliness is the advantage. Computer controls, when are they appropriate? Processing normal recurring transactions, because if you can test the control and it works once, it should work all the time. So computer controls are appropriate for processing normal recurring transactions. High volume would be great for having computer controls. You're going to need some manual controls, though, for processing of unusual or non-recurring transactions. Disadvantages of automated controls include the potential loss of data and the recording of unauthorized transactions. Those are disadvantages of automated controls. Potential loss of data and recording of unauthorized transactions. Another disadvantage of computer-based auditing is that audit documentation may not contain readily observable details of calculations. An auditor will most likely use computer-assisted audit techniques rather than manual techniques. 1, if the auditor wanted to examine all data in a file. Well, you better not be using manual techniques if you want to examine all data in a file. You better use computer-assisted audit techniques there. So 1 looks good. 2, what if you want to review approval of dividends, well, then you would probably use manual techniques, because then you would get familiar with the board of directors minutes and you would determine whether the dividend was authorized. So 2 is wrong. Approval of dividends requires manual, not computer-assisted techniques, because you would have to review the minutes of the board meeting to determine that that dividend was properly authorized. And then 1 was correct. The larger the data set, the more likely the auditor will use computer-assisted audit techniques.